Hello and welcome. Thank you very much for joining the King's Fund online event today when we're going to be discussing leadership and leadership vacancies. Today the King's Fund and NHS providers have published a joint report on the current situation on the tenure of senior leaders in the NHS, and I'm delighted to say we're joined by a panel today in which we're going to be discussing those results. My name is Susie Bailey. I'm the new Exec Director of Leadership and Organisational Development here at the King's Fund. Now I'd like to turn to the panel. Hannah.
Hi, thank you, Susie. My name's Hannah Coffey. I'm the Director of Improvement at Guy's and St Thomas's NHS Foundation Trust, where I've been for about 4 years. I joined the NHS 21 years ago, I'm not quite sure how that happened, as a management trainee, and I've spent time since then in primary, community, and more recently in acute care. I was Chief Operating Officer for 10 years across 3 very different organisations, very challenged and some of the best. And more recently, I have taken on the role of Director of Improvement at Guy's and St Thomas's. I recently graduated from the Aspiring Chief Executive Programme last year.
Thank you. Joe.
Hello Susie, my name is Joe Harrison. I'm the Chief Executive of Milton Keynes University Hospital. I joined the NHS back in 1988 for my sins, and I have spent all of my career in acute hospitals, mostly in London, but spent the last 10 years out of London and have been the Chief Exec at MK now for the last 5.5 years.
Great, thank you for joining us. And Emma.
Hi Susie, I'm Emma Pickup. I'm a senior consultant in the health practice at Gatenby Sanderson. Gatenby Sanderson work with organisations across the public sector and not-for-profit sector to recruit senior leaders and develop them. And I'm part of the health team within the organisation.
Thank you. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to have an initial conversation with the panel, drawing on their experiences you've just heard outlined, and particularly focusing on some of the key results and the findings of our research and the interviews that we did with senior leaders. You can find this report online, and you can also find some infographics which summarise the key results. I'd like to encourage those of you that have been able to join us to post your questions now. There will be an opportunity to ask questions of the panel. The majority of how we spend this session will be questions from you, so I'd encourage you to get your questions in. Also, if you've got any comments or things you'd like to share with the panel in terms of your experience and the areas that we're going to pick up. So I'd like to start with Emma. The report is really around the current leadership vacancies, senior leadership vacancies in the system. Did the results surprise you?
No, I think it did really resonate with the experience that we've had up and down the country, and the types of roles which are proving more difficult to recruit to. I think we've seen a pattern this year compared to last of more roles around HR and strategy coming through, but perhaps not as many as we might have expected around more transformational type leadership and system roles. So yes, there's definitely some synergies there.
And when we think about the particular results, one of the striking things for me was the challenge of recruiting to the operational roles, so Chief Operating Officer or Operations Directors. Hannah, you mentioned your experience over 3 organisations, 10 years as a Chief Operating Officer. Can you give us a bit of perspective about whether that feels difficult to recruit to those kind of roles and your experience as a Chief Operating Officer?
Yeah, thanks, Susie. I mean, so I think you've got to have the passion for it. They're really, really hard roles. And I think increasingly as regulation increases and life gets more difficult, there's quite a lot of focus around the expectations on those roles, both trying to keep the ship sailing, if you like, as well as that sense of looking at the medium and the longer term, which of course, so you're trying to operate in the short, medium and longer term all of the time. And I think it depends on the extent to which where your organisation is. But certainly my experience working in a special measures trust, and one of the first special measures trusts was you're watching an organisation fall apart and trying to build it back up again. And that has, you have to have tremendous both emotional resilience and belief in yourself that you can do that. And I think something gives. For me, it was in my personal life, but I think we need to be realistic about what we're asking of people and just how much time you can spend in an operational role at that level, under that pressure, and continue to be effective and have longevity. Yeah. So I think there's some of the challenge, but best job in the world, but also most knackering.
Yeah. I was hearing several things there. So one is around how doable is the role, the pressure that we now place on our operational staff, the resilience that you have to develop, and kind of how challenging it was to see what was happening to the organisation and to staff. I'm interested to know how you came into a Chief Operating Officer role. You mentioned having been a management trainee. Had you always aspired to do a Chief Operating Officer role, or had you worked with someone who you thought, actually, I'd love to do what they do? What actually got you into that work?
A bit of both. I mean, I think as a management trainee at that time, and I don't know how much different it is now, that was the route that you took. So I'd always thought eventually that's what I would be. But I have had the tremendous privilege of working with a number of very inspiring leaders. I guess we'll talk about that a bit later. But people who I wanted to be like, and I learnt from and invested in me, and that was a huge part of wanting to do the role as they had done it, and to the best of my ability.
We'll come on a bit more later to the kind of how we support leaders both in developing skills and behaviours. But do you think that when you took that role, you were adequately prepared for what being a Chief Operating Officer was? Had the system supported you, had the organisations that had helped with your personal development and professional development geared you up to be ready for that role?
So I became a Director of Ops, as it was, very early in my career. And I think at a time in the NHS when you were able to take risks and it wasn't so obvious when you failed. So to a certain extent, I think I was very lucky. People saw the potential in me, but also supported me. I was at Chelsea and Westminster at that time. And that was great because I made loads of mistakes and I learnt from them, but it didn't have a personal consequence. I think when I think about Basildon, so I suppose when I got to an organisation that I didn't do my due diligence, so I didn't know what I was getting into. But I think it's very easy when you're in good organisations to think that that's about you. And so I went off to Basildon and thought, yeah, I can do this. And then you realise quite what it takes actually to lead an organisation, and how much more it is than structure and process and people. About the culture, the values, the vision, the narrative, and the kind of leadership within that. So I think I learned, and I was talking to my other half about this morning, who has been a head teacher and had a very different experience. But actually, the nature was somebody came into that organisation who believed in me, who trusted me, and demonstrated what you do in that situation, and I learned a huge amount. But I think it could have gone either way, and that has nothing to do with my capability, but it was to do with the umbrella which was put over me and recognising my potential. So to a certain extent, I wasn't prepared for it, but I was lucky. And the 3 years I spent at Basildon, I think, I learnt more about myself and about what it takes to be a leader than I ever would have done if I'd spent my entire career in good and outstanding organisations.
Okay, Jo, I'm going to come to you. So Hannah there describing her kind of fairly challenging experience of being a Chief Operating Officer, but it being the best job in the world. What's it like being a Chief Executive of Milton Keynes?
I absolutely love it, and I know these things are often said by senior leaders, but the reality is that you don't get out of bed and do the sorts of jobs that we do unless you enjoy it. There's lots of other things that can occupy your time if you don't enjoy work. So thoroughly enjoy it. I've been really lucky. I, like Hannah, grew up through the operational route and worked with some brilliant people. And the things that I picked up along the way was everybody is making mistakes every single day, week, month. Have you got an environment that allows you to make those mistakes? Have you got the time and space to correct them yourself, or have others come round and pick up after you? And it doesn't matter whether you're a Chief Operating Officer, Director of Finance, or a Chief Exec. How do you create that space? How does the system create the space for people like me? I remember my first day going in as a Chief Exec, and just how incredibly lonely it is, and how much you rely on your team. And unless we find a way of creating that space for senior leadership to make mistakes, I'm not saying that's what we should set out to do, but actually we need to accept that we're going to fail at certain things and allow people to fail, and then work through how we did it and what we can learn from it and move on from that.
I'd like to come back into some more of that detail. We're just going to go to a poll. So for those of you that have joined us online, we'd like to encourage you to take part in our poll. The question is, whose responsibility is it to ensure the development of high quality leadership in the NHS? Please poll your results now, and we will come back to this later on in the discussion. So Jo, coming back to the question about failure. So I'm interested in how can we ensure that it is easier for people to learn from their mistakes? What can chief executives like yourself do within organisations, so you as an exec team, in setting that right environment? And what do you think national organisations could be doing to make the situation more permissive?
So the report very clearly brings out that we have been through a time whereby individuals are held personally accountable for mistakes and taken out of the system entirely. And we all have the list of names of people where that's happened to them. These individuals didn't become bad leaders overnight because they made a mistake. And so how do we as an NHS, as a health and care system, enable those individuals to either be removed because at that point in time they're a square peg in a round hole, and ensure that the health and care system continues to benefit from their experience and their expertise, or allow the regulatory framework to accept that in a hugely pressurised environment, in a hugely challenging environment, mistakes will be made, and as long as there is evidence of learning. So the example that I use at induction is that we've had 4 Never events at Milton Keynes Hospital, and we haven't dismissed anybody on the back of those Never events. What we've done is we've asked those individuals and those teams to stand up and talk about how, in one instance, a consultant of 20 plus years implanted the wrong implant into a patient. He didn't do it deliberately. A series of events meant that it happened. And how do we learn from that as an organisation? How do we change things? I'm not saying we always get it right, we don't. But actually we still feel, I think, as a system, that the fear of failure and the fear of punishment on the back of failure. So my job in my organisation is to provide that umbrella for my organisation to deliver in an innovative way, to enable people to have the headspace to change and to do things. I'm sure people outside will judge whether that's happening or not, but I see that as a big part of my role.
And just digging in a little bit more, so you gave a clinical example there where something had happened, a clinical error, and the way in which you're kind of creating a safe environment for that to be investigated and to rehabilitate the people involved. Do you think that there is a difference between the way that kind of clinical incidents and, for want of a better word, leadership incidents are perhaps treated, so that perhaps we the approach to patient safety is perhaps more acceptable, that we will investigate failures, whereas if a leader makes an error or there's a problem, that we're more likely to take them out quicker?
I mean, we've seen some horrific examples over the last few months of an example being made. Somebody being taken out of their role as an example to the system, that if they don't deliver on something, they will be removed. I thought that sort of leadership was no longer in existence, and it shouldn't be in existence. Actually, what we want to do is encourage innovation. Is there a difference in approach? I think the focus that we've seen on learning from clinical incidents and the focus on safety has been very positive and has been going on for quite some time now. I'm not sure that we've yet got the maturity of the leadership environment to make that happen.
And just before we go to the poll result, how does that make you feel as an individual when you see what looks like examples being made of people, the sort of personalisation of what one might think are more system failures rather than necessarily purely individual failures? How does that make you feel?
So I've been lucky in my life to know a lot of chief execs, and a lot of those individuals have been at some point in time removed from their role. And so my expectation as a chief exec throughout my career is that at some point I will be that square peg in a round hole. I think people might think that's sad and negative. It might just be that I as an individual am not able to change at the rate that the organisation or the system needs me to. So I understand that there is sometimes that need. For me, what I'm really interested in is how do we, having recently lost a whole cadre of really, really senior NHS managers, whether they're Shelford or others, how do we ensure that we don't continue to lose those leaders that have got the 20, 30 years experience and send really positive messages to the new management trainees coming through, the people that are looking to come into director roles and looking as directors at their chief exec, and being really, really positive about that.
Yeah. So more appreciative about actually
Absolutely.
the roles, the kind of how you both feel about
It's
the
a
kind of
brilliant
careers
job.
that you've had. They're,
Yeah.
they're great jobs. We're going to go to the results of the poll, and I'm actually quite pleased to see what the results are. So the question is, whose responsibility is it to ensure the development of high quality leadership in the NHS? We've got 42% of people taking part in the poll today who think it's the role of NHS Trust. So as you described, Joe, you know, the role that you have as a chief executive leading that team, but also the 45% think that actually the national bodies have a role in creating the right environments and the development of high quality leadership. What more do you think the national bodies could be doing? I'm going to ask each one of you. Hannah.
So can I, because I think that's really interesting, but I have a real view that actually it's a personal responsibility. I think the key is all elements of the system working together. But I spend, for example, probably 20% of my time mentoring, coaching, meeting individuals and providing them with a safe space to have some of those conversations. And sometimes that's just what they need. But I'm doing that because that's what I've learned and people took the time with me.
So you're paying it back.
So I think we all have a responsibility to that. Because whether people listen or not is obviously a completely different matter, but that is a responsibility of all of us. So I think that, yes, of course, at different levels, organisations and regulators need to take responsibility for that, but ultimately we all also need to take as senior leaders, and increasing, the more senior we become, the more time we should be spending and giving back, I think, just as Joe said. So I think the responsibility sits at different levels. I mean, obviously in the report, and we know that there's a bemoaning of the loss of strategic health authorities.
Who would have ever thought
that would be the case? But that kind of sense of strategic talent management, and also, as Joe said, we're all going to make mistakes. There will all be times, and also, we want to be treated with dignity. And recognising that we don't, just because we've had a difficult situation personally, think that means we can't be a leader again, and there won't be an opportunity. So there is something about giving people opportunities to recover, giving them different opportunities. But I think there's a balance of individuals. What organisations do, because of course talent spotting can't be done at a national or even a regional level. We've got to be working in concert with each other. But equally, we have a responsibility to think of it in its broadest sense. And I know that it talks about diversity in the report, but actually, how do we develop the pipeline locally in our own ways, and then how do we share that responsibility around the system? There was an interesting quote in the report, something about you've got to contribute to the pond as well as fishing in it.
Yes.
And I think there's a responsibility of all of us.
Yeah.
I think what the national bodies can do, I think developing people, improving care is a very good document. Everybody needs to take responsibility for actions, not words.
Yeah. Thank you. So one of the things that the report draws out is actually that leadership development and talent management needs to be a shared responsibility. So every part of the system has a role to play. And as you say, there's something about the role of individual leaders in that, the commitment that we need to make, and also encouraging our staff to actually ask for things. So the other thing is kind of, not purely paternalistic, but what is it okay to ask for? And Joe, what more do you think national organisations could be doing? What is their responsibility to sort out?
So there's a really good section in the report that talks about the ghettoisation of leadership backgrounds. And I look at my career, and I've spent 30 years in acute hospitals. The reality of where leadership in the health and care sector is going now is that we need people that can understand the different languages that the different parts of health and care use, whether that's primary care, community, social care, doesn't matter. And so how does the national framework enable leaders to move and have permeable borders between these different organisations, such that we are creating a leadership cadre that can relate to all different parts of the health and care sector. That for me is the role of the national body, and yes, Anna's right, going back to the sort of SHA days, you could go and do a bit of a role centrally and then go back out to another organisation, and there was that sort of magic roundabout type view. That comes with problems, obviously. If you're one of the chosen ones, it works. If not, it doesn't. So that we need to make sure that there is appropriate access. So that's from the national side. I completely agree with the personal piece. I haven't yet found a senior colleague in the NHS who won't openly ask for people to come and speak to them, come and see them if that's what they wish. This whole thing about chief execs being really busy and directors of ops and so on being really busy, yes, of course, and we know that if we don't invest in that next generation, we're going to end up carrying the can for the next 20 years. And I've got young children, I want to enjoy my retirement, and I want brilliant leadership of the NHS in the future. Yeah. So that's part of my responsibility.
Great, thank you. Emma, coming to you. So do you experience this ghettoisation? How risk averse do you think the NHS is in terms of looking to people from different parts of the system and also outside the NHS?
Yeah. I think it's interesting, Susie. I think often, I suppose at the start of a process is the time at which is useful when you're recruiting to really challenge organisations and one another within a leadership team about what are essential criteria for a particular role and how open can you be to looking differently, because actually the system is now looking for different types of leaders, and some of the old job descriptions person specs may need sort of tearing up and rewriting really as we look at different skills. We've done some research into pioneer leaders, so people who really are going to do things differently, so continuing to look for someone who fits and perhaps works as we always have done is maybe something we need to challenge a bit. So yeah, I think that's something that we're seeing developing there. So I think your question was around sort of really where. Sorry, I lost my thread there.
So my question was really around, given the description in the report and also Joe bringing the attention to the fact that we're quite siloed in the NHS. Yeah. So people tend to come up one particular structure. Yeah. It's less likely that if you've been in commissioning that you would be accepted directly into a senior role in an acute trust, as an example. I'm just wondering if that's your experience in your role, and also what we might do to actually address that. How might we encourage there to be more cross-fertilisation across the system?
Yeah. So I think, yes, the NHS for people on the outside looks like one organisation, but actually once you get into there, then there's lots of different routes, I suppose, that you could take. And even within, perhaps if you just were looking at the acute sector, there's sometimes a sense that a colleague might be being disloyal if they're moving to another organisation. So there's a reputational risk for a candidate in going to apply for another role, whether that's because the challenges of that role and what the fear of failure in that might be, or actually what the fear of failure might be if they're not appointed into the role and come back to the previous role. I think in terms of people moving across from commissioning or into providers and perhaps from mental health to acute, I think there's more and more of an appreciation of where those skills are transferable. I still don't see a lot of that movement. I think there are one or two really good examples of where it's worked to the benefit of that organisation to look at some different skills. But I think overall there's a need for where you're going to make the bold choices that the report talks about, for the right level of support to be around individuals, and for boards and chairs or chief executives, whomever's making the appointment, to really feel that they're empowered to make what might be a bold choice and what might need a bit more of a transitional process. I was talking to you earlier, Susie, about a recent example I've had of an organisation very open to looking at a private sector candidate for an operational role. And I think somebody who was very credible was presented at the shortlist. It was difficult for them to compete with somebody who'd come with a whole career of NHS experience, knew all the language. But I think the organisation recognised the transferable skills that were there and the potential that was there. So I think more routes for people who've got those core skills which could offer something new and build that pipeline, would also be useful. I know there's been things in the past, and I think it's something that again could be looked at as another alternative.
So it's quite interesting. So I work in South East London, and we have recently, there's been 3 chief exec appointments in the patch. 2 acute trusts, both of whom are the new chief execs have either come from mental health trust or from community trust, and our mental health trust come from an acute trust. So I think in reality we're starting to see some of that. And if, again, referring back to the report, if we're talking about what are the skills we need in the future NHS, I think it's about individuals. So I think it's where organisations and chairs are prepared to go, do you know what? These people have the kind of component skills, and I'm prepared to take a risk that they can learn the content that they don't have. So I think there's something about where chairs are and aren't prepared to take some of those risks. And then there's a balance about within the organisation, and I certainly do this myself. I'm always looking for the raw material, but you've got to get the balance right, because you've got to have some of the technical skill as well. Otherwise you're in a situation where actually you're not being fair to your team. But there was a quote particularly in the report around from a mental health chief exec, which said actually the acute trust, whilst they may look down their noses at us, there's a lot that we've been doing for years on system leadership and integrated care that they could learn, and improvement that we could learn. So I think that's where it's starting to shift. So I think there is definitely some movement. I'm seeing it, but I do think it still does come down to the chairs, whether they're willing to look at the raw material, whether they're willing, as Emma says, then to provide the package of care and support, because there's no point just kind of dropping somebody expecting them to do that. And I guess, as we'll talk about, where they are on the CQC rating, because I think people's ability and willingness to take a risk with these things is highly dependent on those things.
So 2 things to pick up on. So we'll come back to the CQC rating in a minute, but you talked about the kind of package of support that ought to be in place. The report draws out the fact that actually the over half of the executives now in post have been in post less than 3 years. Reactions to that, Joe?
So we know that we have got lots of people wanting to progress. So from a very positive, glass half full, it's brilliant. My workforce director leaves today, going to another organisation. She will appear in the statistics that she will only have been in post for a few months. So we get churn, we know that, and in some respects it's really, really positive. To have, I think it's 54% of people in post for less than 3 years is really challenging for organisations trying to build stable teams, trying to show the organisation that leadership from the top at the board table, that there is a set direction of travel that everybody is buying into. Again, there's a commentary in here that talks about the individual who knows that if they keep their head down for a couple of years, their boss will change. Actually, that's no way to run an organisation. And so how do we ensure that we maintain stability in organisations and enable ambition and learning as people move between different organisations? And I think that, for me, also comes back to that national role about making sure that people move appropriately. So how long is too long in an organisation as a chief exec or a coup where you become inculcated in the ways of? It demonstrates in here it takes 5 years for a chief exec and her team to make a real impact. 10 years, is that too long? Should somebody be tapping that individual on the shoulder? I'll be getting some glares from some of my more established colleagues. And that experience could be amazing in one of those CQC inadequate or challenged organisations.
So what do you think? We're going to go to some questions in a minute that have been coming through. What do you think is possible in terms of, Emma was quite rightly pointing out that yes, it's one NHS, but there are lots of individual organisations. And at the moment, senior leaders are appointed to an individual institution, not to a system or to a national scheme. Do you think there's any changes that we need to see in the way that managers are appointed and perhaps the contracts?
Yes, so we hear Dido Harding and Ian Dalton now openly talking about that leadership contract. How do we encourage our best, our most experienced, however we judge those, to go and do some of the hardest jobs? and give them that leadership contract, whatever that might look like, whether it's time, whether it's space, whether it's support, to go into these organisations safe in the knowledge that in 18 months' time they are not going to feel a full force of regulation and they will be personally indicted as being responsible. How do we structure that leadership conversation and contract to appropriately define what success looks like? Most of the organisations that we see in the NHS that are challenged haven't become challenged overnight. No. We all know who they are. Every now and again there's a spike of some organisation that we didn't expect. But the reality is we know as an NHS leadership cadre where those organisations are, who they are. And a lot of us think, actually, we'd love to have a go at that. And how do we ensure that we have the time, the space, the capacity and capability around us to solve some of what are really interesting and challenging organisations?
Yeah. Thank you. I'd like to thank everyone that's been sending in some questions. We're going to go to some questions now. One of the questions is that although the vacancies look high, actually compared to FTSE organisations, they're looking quite good. So we've got one of the questions is there a danger that we talk ourselves down and create a negative narrative about senior roles in the NHS that's unhelpful?
So I will start by saying I think both Hannah and I started our introductions by saying how brilliant we think and believe our own roles are, our individual roles are. So I think when you talk and listen to senior leaders, people do say they are amazing jobs. Where I think we've focused some of this conversation is about how do we support them to become even better? How do we support the senior leadership pipeline to become even better, such that organisations and systems have got real choice and real opportunity to absolutely pick the best and not the only application?
Emma?
Yeah, I think the sorry, I've lost my train of thought.
Do you think we talk ourselves down in the NHS? Do you still get lots of people wanting to apply for roles?
I think back to that point about the undoable job. That struck me in the report that I do get candidates who they are, as Jo said, they are interested in a challenging role. I don't think people necessarily are looking in the NHS for an organisation where everything's steady state and they wouldn't find one if they wanted one. But I think they are looking for a challenge when they're looking for a new opportunity. However, they are looking for that doable challenge, and I think the more that people sometimes look into these organisations, which, as you say, have not just started on a downward trend, they've actually been in some difficulty for some time. It is about the time that they're seen that they're allowed to actually have to progress that organisation and the support that they'll have around them to do that. I think increasingly we're seeing regulators involved in appointments, not just with Special Measures Trusts, but with lots of organisations, and clearly their focus is on the performance of the organisation operationally, and also the individual may be interested more in that strategic longer term view. Actually, you need both those that operational grip and the longer term strategic thinking in one individual, and there's no sort of compromise around that. So I think there are some positive signs, but I think there are definitely challenges when you actually come in to make that appointment.
Could I just sort of build on that as well, which is the comparison with the FT and the FTSE 100 is really interesting, and I think when we hear Dido and in conversation and Ian talking about the football manager analogy, so it's fine for a football manager to do 18 months, then get sacked and walk away with the 5 million. Who here can remember the Bank of Scotland chief executive who was sacked and publicly vilified and won't work again theoretically, but walked away with a multi-million pound payoff, Fred Goodwin? And actually, when you look at the chief execs and other directors that are sacked and who never work in the health service again, that's a really, really high price to pay. And so I'm not suggesting for 1 second that we are talking sort of big payoffs for NHS managers. But I think when we start to compare with the private sector, and it's the personal cost, and the report also does talk about how people do get publicly, individually identified and vilified in certain situations. That's a high price to pay.
Absolutely. Another question we've had come in. Oh, do you want to add?
Yeah, because I think I'm wondering about the question, because I think there was something about why, you know, are vacancies a bad thing? Is churn a bad thing? And I think, I mean, Joe talked about that a little bit earlier, but I think there's something by which if you narrow down what the report says, when you look at the really challenged organisations, and I think that the challenge there is around, so who endures in organisations in the NHS? Clinicians, ultimately. And as a consequence, that's where you've got to make the cultural change, ultimately. And that's what I think sets often the culture of an organisation. So there is something about inadequate organisations, the amount of interims they have, the churn of that, and the ability of the organisation to set a clear strategy and narrative as a collective team, the belief that that team are going to be there and are going to look after the best interests of that organisation, even getting people hooked in to wanting to believe and use their discretionary time to make that organisation better rather than just doing the day-to-day job. So I think there is something, there are parallels to learn, but I think when we actually look beneath the surface, of course churn is great. I've learned everything I have by comparing between organisations, and that's great, and I encourage people to do that all the time, but I think it's a balance. And when you look at the organisations that most need stability, and you look at the vacancy rates, and you know, Joe and I were talking beforehand about, you know, how many of the inadequate trusts are actually represented in the report. I mean, it's not many of them. You know, the reality is, I remember working with an organisation that had 30 different exec directors in 18 months. I mean, how can you do anything in that situation, or at least expect any of the staff in that organisation to believe and buy into the change?
Engaged. Yeah.
So, and I think that is a particular challenge in the health service when we've got patients at the end of it, and the impact of engagement and leadership has such an important consequence.
Yeah. I think added to that, having just moved from NHS Improvement, there is a recognition that the regulatory burden that is placed on organisations and leaders in special measures or in difficulty means that actually that executive team, that board, has got spending a lot of time dealing with the regulatory colleagues rather than necessarily spending time in the organisation helping to support and drive improvements. So that's an added burden. One of the other questions we've had is that the question is, are there too many chief executives in the NHS, and are we trying to shoot for something that actually is impossible? Perhaps we need some structural change. Hannah, I'm interested, you did the Aspiring Chief Executives programme. Perhaps you could tell colleagues a little bit more about that.
Are there too many chief execs? Well, actually, in lots of ways, the world is changing, and there are less and less of them as groups and other models. And you know, I think that's going to be a direction of travel. So I think we should try not to get too obsessed about chief execs and think about leadership and system leaders. And you know, being a chief exec isn't the be all and end all, and shouldn't be where those skills are necessarily going. But yeah, so I think the Aspiring Chief Exec programme was brilliant,
Why was it brilliant for you?
Why was it brilliant? Well, because, you know, I think I had the raw kind of component parts, but it was really helpful to stand back and think about how, you know, what's my story? You know, why am I here? What's important to me? How am I going to connect with people and make them think that I've got their best interests of heart in the organisation? And thinking about, you know, what's important, where you should be spending your time, and diversity was a big focus. And I think, you know, I'm an identical twin, so I can spot the biggest bit of cake from about 20 paces. So I kind of thought, well, I understand what fairness is. And I think it really encouraged us to think, you know, actually, how do you get into the roots of your organisation and really understand and stand in the shoes of all staff, and understand your role in creating an organisation that supports all of them. And I think that was really powerful. Reverse mentoring. We had a patient and a staff mentor who weren't shy about telling you know. So I think there were ways that it was structured, I think, that really got me to think about who I was, what chief exec I wanted to be, some of the component parts of what that looks like, which was much more about system leadership and behaviours, visibility, role modelling, how you spend your time, than it was about, do I understand? I mean, governance was an important part of it, but it was really quite balanced. And for me, having been a chief executive, a chief operating officer, and a kind of heroic leader, a real opportunity to kind of go, well, how do I, if I'm going into that role, get the work done, but not do it myself? And if you're going to survive as a chief executive, you've got to understand that, because the organisation needs you to be doing a role which isn't necessarily the role that perhaps the regulators think you should be doing, pushing patients through ED and understanding what your performance was 2 seconds ago. But at the same time, it was really important, I think, to understand how you'd be spending your time and how you develop, support, coach your staff to do that, and actually, frankly, to sustain after you've gone.
Yeah. Can we come on to the big issue of diversity that the report draws attention to? Anyone familiar with Roger Klein's work, Snowy White Peaks, won't be surprised to see that the data is still showing that we don't have enough diversity at the most senior levels in our organisations. Jo, what's your perspective on what that data is showing us?
It's showing what we know. It's showing that we're not changing fast enough. We talked before we sat down that this panel does not have a BME representative on it. Sarah Jane's stance at Birmingham around being very clear that she won't sit on panels without that level of diversity, I think is really, really important. How do we do it? We need to spot talent, we need to bring talent through, and whilst we have got some emphasis on that in the NHS, I'm not sure that we have enough emphasis on it as yet. I'm fortunate at Milton Keynes in that I do have a particularly diverse board, which is fantastic. It wasn't a deliberate construct, and some of us need to think through very clearly how we do make many more deliberate choices about that. And also not just at that executive board table. This is right the way through the leadership sort of DNA of the organisation. How are we encouraging all of our organisation to interact in a way that we can best represent our population? And I don't yet know of an organisation that from an acute hospital perspective is in that place. Again, we know that community mental health organisations tend to be better than acute hospitals at appropriately representing. And so what can we learn from different parts of the health and care sector?
We've got a question that's been sent in around, in view of the lack of BAME representatives at the board level, should there be increased focus and visibility of potential leaders? So is there more that could be done, as you say, at the kind of
absolutely
more entry level and middle tier?
Yeah. So how are we actively going out into our community? So one of my roles as a chief exec is to go and talk along with my exec colleagues at local schools, at local universities, to encourage people to come into the NHS, to pick up talent and to work with those individuals, to actively promote them into NHS leadership. And we as an NHS have a responsibility to do that. Whether there's an opportunity to overlay, I hesitate, because there's always that, well, let's set a target. Let's have a performance regime wrapped around this, when actually this is about behaviours, it's about attitudes, and it's about a zero tolerance to any sort of behaviour that undermines the development of appropriate representation throughout my organisation and every organisation.
Thanks, Jo. Emma?
I think it's true. Obviously, the report, as Jo says, points out what we know about the statistics on that. I heard a chief executive talking recently about sort of the quiet leadership concept, and really, I suppose, people not necessarily self-selecting themselves as a leader, but actually that talent management and talent spotting in organisations to say, actually, you represent a different perspective, and you could lead, and actually it's not something people necessarily recognise in themselves. I think the way in which we've got involved at Gatenby Sanderson around diversity has been more focused on what can be done about the non-executive body, because clearly you're looking there at a wider potential pool, and increasingly we've been asked by clients for more diversity when we're searching for people for those roles. then the challenge comes when you're making the bold choice at the interview panel for somebody who perhaps isn't as familiar with the sector, perhaps hasn't learnt the lingo, and you've got those people against somebody who's done it before and actually is a safe choice. So I think there's a challenge there, but we've developed an insight programme which does give people opportunity to come from underrepresented backgrounds and to shadow existing non-executives and get experience working with boards and deciding really whether it is a place they feel they can contribute, and next time they go for an interview, hopefully with some more insight to be able to, I suppose, link their experience, both the life experience and professional experience, to where that might add value there. So I think there's action that can be taken, but obviously there's lots of different strands that need to be addressed.
Joe, did you want to come in?
Two specific examples come to mind around this question. One is Navina Evans put on Twitter, she's Chief Exec of East London Mental Health Trust, the other day, where she was in a room, a group of people, and a man was coming in to present, and he came in the room and gave her the memory stick to plug in. Now, this is one of the most successful chief execs we've got in the NHS, and there was a bit of a self-reflective moment around whether she should have behaved differently. It's not just her responsibility, it's everybody in that room to call out those sorts of behaviours and tackle that individual in a way that says that is totally unacceptable. The other example is a really interesting NHS example, which was Claire Murdoch, saying that we quite often talk about out-of-hospital services and how absolutely wrong that is. And she's completely right. Yeah. They are not out-of-hospital services. They are services in their own right that support, in the same way that acute services support the delivery of health and care to our population. So again, calling these behaviours out, not just those that have it done to them, but everybody in the system has to be able to say something to make this change happen.
Yeah, so we're talking about what we can do around protected characteristics in terms of diversity, but we're actually talking about diversity of thought, diversity of experience, aren't we, about how to be much more open to that. One of the questions that we've had come through was particularly picking up, Joe and Hannah, on your experience coming through the operational route, which, as you said, it was kind of the standard route as a management trainee that you'd come through, myself also. So the question to you both was, are there other routes that people could come through to reach senior levels in the health system? And if so, what are they? So I think people are looking for some advice. What do they do if they haven't come up the typical operational management route?
I'll give you some thinking time. So the report talks about the increasing number of clinicians, which is fantastic. And not when we talk about clinicians, it's not just the doctors, it's the broad spectrum of clinicians who are coming into senior leadership roles, which is fantastic. So I started off my career as a medical records clerk. So for me, it's about finding really, really good people and engaging with those really, really good people and finding a way that you can hang on to their coattails, as I did, that you can learn from them and to take opportunities as and when they arise. And I can't imagine a cadre of chief execs that were only made up of operational people. I don't know if Hannah would agree, but I think it would be a disaster.
Can you imagine? It'd be brilliant every day, but in the longer term. So I think it does link to the last point that we just talked about, and some of the things we were talking about around sort of taking risks. So obviously the operational management route has been the kind of traditional route, but I think the world is changing, and if we think about the kind of this poor group of people who've been labelled millennials, and if we think about the reality of the age we're actually going to retire, there's no hurry. And this is a piece of advice I give everybody. There is no hurry, and make sure that when you get there, you're really good. So I think that firstly, I think we should be encouraging people to come out of industry into the NHS, and I think we should be creating different sorts of experiences for within the NHS. So, for example, at Guy's and St Thomas's, we have a secondment scheme with NHSI, because obviously, both of us are going to benefit from having those sorts of experiences in our longer term careers. So making some of those opportunities available. But I think it also comes back to diversity. You know, where are you fishing from, and do these people even think that they can do those roles if that's not reflected at the top of the organisation? So I think that my advice would be take every opportunity you can to get a broad experience, because as you said, you know, and I'm thinking about that now, you know, next role, chief executive, well, is it? You know, what are the other opportunities? What other strings could I add to my bow that might make me even better by the time that I get there? So I think there's something, don't assume you need a 5-year plan. I've met one person in my life who's actually had a 5-year plan and executed it. Take some of the opportunities that you can to do different things. Find somebody who's looking out for you and your development. I have a fantasy football team. I always talk about the people that I know over time, maybe part of my my kind of future organisation, and take every opportunity to get different experiences. And 3 things I always say to individuals when they're looking for a role: go for the person that you're going to work for, then go for the organisation, and then go for the job, because they're in that order, because that's where you're going to get somebody's going to develop you, stretch you and challenge you. The role, the name is something, you know, that changes and is very different between organisations.
I think absolutely agree, and I would also add the demands that the operational roles place on individuals is significant, no question about it, and doing different roles at different times of your life are also really, really important. Mm-hmm. And you know, I said earlier, I have young children. I'm really clear that the chief exec role, like any other senior role, can consume your entirety. I've got very, very clear boundaries about when I go home and look after my children. That doesn't mean I don't re-engage later on in the evening, but it's on my terms. And thinking that through and thinking through the impact of the different types of roles, where you are in your personal life is so important. And so therefore, is operations the only route? Definitely not. I spent 6 or 7 years in the corporate part of different organisations, learning about performance, information, IT, different things. So that blend, there seriously is no rush.
Thanks. We've had another question around recruiting for values. So there's been a reflection that the panel talked a lot about skills and the kind of experience you've got, but do you think we're doing enough to actually recruit on the basis of values? Perhaps if I come to you first, Emma.
I think, it's a good challenge actually, because I was conscious of that. I think it is one of the things that, again, up front needs to be part of that initial discussion about what are we looking for in an appointment. I'm just about to start working with an organisation who are already doing that piece of work, so they're looking for a new chief executive and actually going out and engaging with their stakeholders, their service users, and really trying to shape up how they describe their next leader through that process. I think that also then plays in at the end of a process where you're actually making that appointment, and the values very much come through in the wider engagement that individuals have with the people who use the services, with the wider stakeholder groups, and how you involve and engage them and listen to that feedback coming into the panel. So the panel may be focused perhaps more on the knowledge and skills and the approach, but actually you've got that wider voice coming into it. I think that can also be augmented with some psychometric assessment, which again is about an individual's preferences, and you will just learn more about them through their own self-reflection. So I think increasingly, yes, it's important that we don't just think about what people have done, but we think about how they've done it, and how aware they are of their impact on other people through that.
Yeah, I think it's one of the lessons that I really learned through being on the Aspiring Chief Exec programme. I think about how you bring yourself to work, and competence is really important, and what you've delivered is really important, but actually fundamentally it's about who you are and how you do the job. that's what people want to see. And if that means you admit a vulnerability and you don't know the answer, so be it, because people have got to be able to connect you. I mean, values, that's why I'm here. I grew up in a public sector family. That's always been, isn't what I do, it's who I am. And I think we have to kind of carry ourselves every day and hold on to those values, because actually I think some of the challenge in what we talk about in terms of regulatory scrutiny is resilience. I think, again, it came out in the report. It's not kind of getting through it, trying harder. It's holding on to what's true to you despite the system and not becoming institutionally blind to what is not acceptable. And you have to, as a leader, I think you have to have that responsibility, and then you have to imbue it in your team and in your organisation. And that means how you recruit, it means how you purport yourself every day. The more senior and more remote you become, the more people will pay attention to what you do, not what you say. And I think the other thing is you've got to challenge poor behaviour. And there is so much evidence to suggest that that's when organisations start taking you seriously. You do it well, you do it dignified, you do it fairly, but you take responsibility for holding people to account for those people who do not show those values. And then I think you also have to call it out, and that that takes bravery, because if you're in an inadequate trust, feeling like you're in a situation where you're being asked to do things you don't want to do in a way that you think is a poor reflection of the system, calling that out is a brave thing to do. But I think fundamentally we have a responsibility as leaders to do that, and hope that there's a critical mass in the system that would support you. But I think if we don't have that at our core, we might as well go home.
We've had another question which touches on that as well, which is around the kind of leadership development and coaching that senior leaders have. You've described the kind of, owning the role and kind of having personal responsibility. Have you both had coaching or mentoring experiences for yourselves? And are you still accessing those in order to do your jobs?
Absolutely yes to both questions. And I think being able to have that safe space to test things out, to be challenged by somebody who knows you, maybe not the NHS, but to get into a conversation about why you're taking certain decisions and what's supporting those decisions and what's behind it, comes back a bit to the values piece. Why do I get really, really grumpy about certain things? And when you start to get into that, it's normally because the feeling of being really, really uncomfortable, being asked to do things that are just not right. And so how do you get back on course and do the right thing? So absolutely yes. I would be surprised if there were senior leaders around who didn't sort of access that, and even if they believed that they were an island and could cope, and good luck, I'm not that good. No, I'm not that good, definitely.
And Hannah?
Yeah, so I wouldn't be where I am if I didn't have and believe in mentors and people who have, and I think there's obviously a very distinct difference between the two, people who've seen and supported me through the thick and thin. In terms of coaching, yes, I don't actually have a coach at the moment, but I have. And I think coaching is different in the sense that sometimes what you need changes over time, the type of coach you need and when you need coaching. So I think, I always call upon that when I want to. But I went through the experience of becoming a coach. I was doing coaching training last year, which actually was fascinating. So if there's any, in terms of any ability to kind of make you sit on your hands and not try and answer the question and allow people to come to their own conclusion, if there's anything that puts you actually in a good position to be a leader, I think it's going through that training and trying to use some of those skills in your everyday life. It's absolutely critical.
We're just in the final couple of minutes now, and we've had a question that, again, sort of draws on what you've just been describing, which is the practice of what is often described as collective leadership. So you've both talked about practicing as leaders a more collective approach. Certainly, as my experience as a management trainee and coming up through the system is you were originally expected to have all the answers as a manager, and actually think the practice of being a leader or a manager now is much more about how you involve the whole team in that. So do you think there's more that could be done in organisations in the NHS to truly practice collective leadership, and where do you think we are at the moment in the practice of that?
For me, the biggest blank space is patient engagement and the engagement of individuals in their care, and as a consequence, the involvement in the leadership of and development of the health and care sector as a whole.
Yeah.
We still don't listen to the patient voice as a whole system.
Great. So we need to involve patients on the team. Hannah, final word from you?
Yeah, I think it's what my job is, as far as I'm concerned. I think it's about not having the answers, but creating the conditions for those that do, to try, fail, continuously improve, and that the resources of the organisation and the system support them to do that. In doing that, that means that there has to be alignment with a regulatory structure, because that means taking risks, autonomy, and making mistakes, and they're not always kind of widely accepted, but all of the evidence is there about that's where the longer term successful organisations are, and we've got to be able to do that.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank you all for joining us this afternoon. A recording of this session will be available soon on the King's Fund website. Please encourage colleagues to take a look at the results from the report and let us have any comments that you might have. I'd like to thank our panel, Emma, Joe and Hannah. Thank you very much. Goodbye.